Welcome. I am Dr. Mutshaba, co-organizer of the Mobility Roundtable, based at the Scapens Eye Research Institute, Mass Eye and Ear at the Harvard Medical School. I will be starting the roundtable and introducing the speaker, and we will have speakers have their introduction and talk, and then myself and my co-organizer, Dr. Andrew Tomlinson from the University of Leeds in the UK, will guide the Q&A and close the session. Mobility and disability, creating an inclusive system. With current changes, the importance of having an inclusive mobility system has become more and more. It is due to all social media and all the movements that happen, we have become more aware of the challenges that disabled community go through on their daily life. So it's a very timely topic, especially with the COVID and the current changes in technology related to mobility, to have this conversation. And hopefully this will be the first of many in this topic. We're going to jump right into the talk with our first speaker. We have two great speakers today, Ms. Charlotte McClain-Nhlapo, the Global Disability Advisor for the World Bank Group, and human rights lawyer and disability rights, inclusive development and social justice advocate. Charlotte, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this roundtable on how to create an inclusive mobility system. I wanted to start off by responding to the question that was posed to the roundtable, which is, how do you create an inclusive mobility system? And the first point I'd like to make is that it's important to coalesce around a framework or a set of norms. And here I offer the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is now being ratified by 183 countries and making it almost universal. The treaty addresses specific issues on accessibility and mobility, and it promotes independent living in the community for persons with disabilities. These are all, of course, key drivers to ensuring that everyone can live independently. My second point is that it's essential to speak and engage with a multidisciplinary team. And so I welcome this discussion here today. We all know that it is important to work across disciplines, but we often all fall back into our siloed ways of working and our secluded or excluded spaces. So I'd like to share with you an occasion that signposted in bright neon lights the importance of working across disciplines. Last year, I was invited to Abu Dhabi to the coveted 26th World Road Association Congress to moderate a session called the Foresight Session on Disability Inclusive Road Transport. It was the first time that disability was on the agenda of this Congress. And so there obviously was a lot of excitement. I had a great panel, many of whom were persons with disabilities themselves. At the end of the Congress, there was a vote. And the session on disability inclusive road transport was voted the best of the Congress, the best session of the Congress. And I share this example because it really brought home to me the message that we do not do enough bridging and fostering discussion and curating of knowledge with others. We typically talk to those that already think like us. And so it's really pivotal that we think about a multidisciplinary approach if we want to see scale and ownership across the board. The next thing that I wanted to say is that, we have at least 1 billion people with disabilities across the world, and that adults with disabilities make just 73% of trips that people without disabilities make. This, of course, you can imagine, has changed with the COVID-19 pandemic, where we're all making fewer trips, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So I wanted to just spend a few minutes talking about what we're doing at the World Bank to address mobility and disability. Well, we've made some very ambitious commitments. One of these commitments is by 2025, all new urban mobility and rail projects supporting public transport services will be inclusive in their designs so as to incorporate key universal access features for persons with disabilities and limited mobility. In addition, aligned with the SDGs, the New Urban Agenda, and the World Bank's own environmental and social framework, the bank is taking action to ensure that equity considerations remain at the forefront of initiatives like the Sustainable Mobility for All initiative. We're also advocating for enhanced road safety outcomes. And that work is being led by the Global Road Safety Facility. But in addition to that, we're developing analysis on mobility and road use patterns in Ghana, in Ukraine, and using a disability lens to understand that. More recently, we hosted the Transforming Transportation Conference at the bank, and there was a very good session on mobility and disability presented there. But allow me to turn back to my point on the current COVID-19 pandemic, because we know from the history of pandemics, as far back as the Athens plague of 430 BC, which changed the tide of battle in the Athens war against Sparta, and then, of course, the London pandemic of cholera, that pandemics have a way of leaving their mark on society. They adjust our mobility and how we interact with others. And so while everybody is affected by a global pandemic, we also know that older persons and people with disabilities who may have underlying conditions are disproportionately affected by the impact. And this has a bearing in terms of restrictions on their mobility, their health, and their well-being. We also know that COVID-19 itself has had a huge impact on transport and mobility. And this has been in relation to how we social distance, the lockdown policies for affected areas, and it's very much disrupted mobility and connectivity everywhere. So I think in the short and medium term, once the pandemic is under control, countries should look at introducing new regulations to make mobility and transport more resilient, more safe, and absolutely more accessible. This hopefully will be part of the new normal. We are witnessing the importance of having an inclusive mobility system in place as we see how vaccines are being rolled out. Already we're beginning to see some red flashing lights in relation to mobility. In London, just last week, the plan to distribute over 4,000 vaccines a day was not met. That target was not met by a long shot. And one of the reasons was that mobility and accessibility had not been addressed sufficiently. And so people who were to receive the vaccines were not able to move from their homes to the centers where vaccines were available. And so I think this really allows us to pause and to rethink about the virtues of inclusive mobility systems. And we really need to underscore its centrality in terms of the lives of persons with disabilities, how it relates to their employment, how it relates to their economic development. And I'd like to conclude by putting some ideas on the table. So the one point that I wanted to put out there was the use of digital technology and how we can use that to be more inclusive in terms of developing systems. And then I also wanted to share some work that's been done in terms of using market-based incentives that can also provide solutions. So both in the Philippines and in South Africa, the government has incentivized owners of informal buses and vans with kind of the nudge method to look at how they can replace their old buses with buses that are more accessible. And I mentioned this because I think it's important for us when we think about having, mobility systems, inclusive mobility systems, that we think about the range of options. And the range needs to take into account low and middle-income countries. Context is very, very important. I also want to put on the table the importance of having disaggregated data on disability. And this is important for a host of reasons, but it's very important if we're to look at better policy making and have regulatory processes that address the needs of persons with disabilities. And then I think we need to think about how we make a stronger case to show the cost-benefit analysis for disability and mobility. In sum, I would say a couple of things need to happen. We need to have better planning, ensure that universal design and access is present at the conceptualization and the design phase of any work that we do. We need to invest in building capacity, using the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but also looking at, domestic regulations that may support mobility. And then we need to look at ensuring that we put in place local and national grievance mechanisms so that people can report and register, systems that are not accessible. That helps us then loop back and address that. And then finally, my last piece would be to ensure that we have in place strong institutions to enforce the norms and regulations that we put in place, and be that guiding light in terms of how we develop inclusive mobility systems. And I just want to close by saying, I think of this as, inclusive development being democracy in action. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Charlotte. That was great. Perfect. So we move to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Cathy Stern. She's my neighbor. She's based in Boston area. She's a behavioral optometrist, board certified in vision therapy, developmental optometry, and Neuro-Optometric rehabilitation. Cathy, please.
Thank you. I have not been part of this forum before, and I thank you for the invitation. And I have to say, Charlotte, you made a number of points that were on my list here, so I will kind of reiterate them because clearly they're important. So I'll tell you just as background that not only am I an optometrist who has been working for 40 years with people who have visual issues that are not just limited sight, but also people who have good eyesight, but have difficulty in understanding the space and their environment, and therefore also have a disability that's just as hidden, if not more hidden, than when someone has a sight impairment. And so that's one of the issues around vision and hearing as well, which is that these are disabilities that are more hidden than things like someone being in a wheelchair, or someone walking with crutches, or someone having a cast on their arm or a brace on their leg. So I think that makes it even more challenging because it's not clear that the person may need assistance or is entitled to some of the kinds of things we're talking about. So that's one piece. But basically, I think that the biggest thing for me in terms of what I do is that not only do I understand that from the patients I've worked with, but I have a special interest in assistive technology. And I have a sister who was visually impaired, who's now blind, and I have a niece who's visually impaired. So I've seen it kind of from all sides. And it's an interesting kind of thing because I was, for example, involved with a hackathon for devices for people with visual impairment. And it started off by just having people who were visually impaired and had some specific needs they hoped that they would work on, get up and talk about their needs and also make themselves accessible to the students who were working on these projects during the time of the hackathon, because it's interesting that if you've never really had spent time with someone with visual impairment, you don't really have a good sense about it. And so, like Charlotte said, the first thing is that anytime you go to do any type of project, you need to have the end user in the room from day one. So that's number one. And what I find is that a lot of people think that they know what someone wants and they create it, and then it doesn't work well for that person. I was involved in a project over a number of years in India called Engineering the Eye, and we had optometrists and we had design students and engineering students. And we had patients, and we were, in a week, we ideated and prototyped and tested devices, some of which went on to commercial production. So it can be done, and it can be done quickly, but it went much better because you had all these players in the room with no egos, just wanting to work together to come up with the best solutions. And everybody had an equal place at the table. So that's one. The other is that if we're talking about disability policy, we just need to talk about anything that's inclusive. And it has to, any policies that we come up with need to really think about everyone who is going to be involved with it. And I do think that one of the best things that is talked about is universal design, because if you have a curb cut for someone with a wheelchair, it's equally helpful to a mother with a baby in a stroller. And to tell you the truth, it's equally helpful to someone who's got a sprained ankle, or someone who's older and can't step up to some of the high curbs and things as easily. And so I think when we're talking about policy or the kinds of things that can happen, it doesn't necessarily have to be a complete rethink. I think that it can include things that we already have, but can leverage them in new ways. So for example, here in Boston, my niece, who's visually impaired, lives here, and she's entitled to take public transportation at no cost to her, which is nice. But also they now have a partnership with Uber that she has, I think, 10 Ubers a month that she can take for a couple of dollars. She doesn't have to pay necessarily the full fee because she lives on a very, very limited income. And so it is a way of providing opportunity to the Uber drivers, and it helps her get to places, and she tends to use it more in the wintertime when even just getting to the subway can sometimes be tricky when it's icy and she doesn't see well, and she's worried about falling. So I think that there are things that are already there. I think that as new products get rolled out, they need to be done in a way that considers all the needs of anyone with a disability, because it's universal design, because it's easier for everyone, and because that's much easier sometimes than just the kind of retrofitting that you go around trying to do. So if we can start that conversation earlier and earlier, then, and right from the beginning of the design of these things, then I think they will be there more quickly, because sometimes otherwise the rollout tends to take way too long. I do think that there's a lot of emphasis, I think, now on developing more sustainable communities and smart cities. And I do think that as that comes along, again, the end user needs to be part of it. But for those of us who understand, at least in part, more about these more hidden disabilities, we need to make ourselves more known, and we need to encourage people with the disabilities to make themselves more known. You know, if I were going to the subway every day and I saw someone struggling to get onto the subway train because they were in a wheelchair, because they used a cane, because they were visually impaired, I might be thinking a little bit more about the issues that they have. But because they tend to not use these services because they're not accessible, I don't think the visibility is out there. It's kind of like when children need things, you know, we say they don't really have a good group out there always advocating for them because they can't advocate for themselves. And it's not that people with disabilities can't advocate for themselves, but they are not always in the community in a way that makes them more visible. And I think that's true because we know that they are significantly underemployed or unemployed. And it's nice that maybe some large companies have more people with disabilities there, but it's still very, very small numbers in a way that that I think is not at a level where it's so evident to everyone in the community. And I do think that in terms of any kind of technology, it's really easy to make it more disability inclusive, especially today with the kind of modeling that we can do. It's certainly a lot easier than it was at one time to appreciate before you even make your first prototype how some of that is going to play out. And so I think we need to get at the root of even maybe educating engineers and designers more, not just looking at, let's say, the MBTA here for our transportation system, but even who's designing the cars, who's telling them about how to make the tracks, who's giving them the information. And I think part of that is getting some of this more into the schools, the universities, where they're teaching these kinds of things. I know that in some cases I have been involved with some projects or seen projects where, let's say for their junior or senior year, when they have to, to make something that they are working with people from the community that have those kinds of needs. But we need to do more with that and make that should be an absolute required course in every engineering program, in every design program, that there's a better understanding of these kinds of things. And I do think that that if we can see more of it, if we can see more people with disability, and again, vision and hearing are those kinds of things that are harder to actually see, that would be helpful. I think that, again, getting it into schools where it starts right from the get-go so that architects and engineers and designers all have that information. And I think that the more we think about universal design, that will continue to be helpful. And I do think that any kind of environmental barrier needs to be addressed, including transportation, and perhaps with the advent of greater technology and this emphasis or beginning emphasis towards smart cities, because more and more people are moving into cities out from rural areas. And then also, how do we take the infrastructure that already exists and make it more safe for everyone, including in places like low and middle developing countries, because I know actually in India just a week or so ago, a colleague, not someone I knew, but a friend of a friend, was killed because she and her daughter were riding a three-wheeler at night, and there was a drainage ditch that had filled with water because it had been raining very hard. And I guess at night the lighting wasn't very good and they didn't see it. And this bike tipped over into this ditch and no one found them for several hours. And so, these are the kinds of things that have to be, better addressed. And I do think one of the ways is to start early on with even having people go through just some simple demonstrations of what it's like to be in the world. And I'll just finish up with when I was in college, we did kind of a disability piece where we had everyone either go in a wheelchair or maybe we put a blindfold on someone, and we had them actually go out around the campus and try to do tasks that we would normally do. In those days, it was if you were hearing impaired, you might have to call for information on the phone or just try to get around the campus in a wheelchair. And it was very enlightening to see what happens, to someone who has a disability. So I think if we can provide those kinds of things even early on to school children, then again, everyone will have a better feeling for it.
Thank you very much, Cathy. Both talks were great. Thank you. So before I move to my questions and audience question, if Charlotte and Cathy, if you like to raise a point about each other's talk, or if you want to have ask a question from each other, please go ahead.
Sure, I'll go ahead and just pick up on something that Cathy mentioned. So you can't see, but I actually use a wheelchair. And I'm often, I guess I'm not crazy about simulation exercises, and I'll tell you why. I think when you have simulation exercises, yes, a person may be able to understand how difficult it is to get across the street in a wheelchair, people don't yield to you, and they may be able to understand the physical aspects of it. What it doesn't tell you, and what it doesn't show you, it doesn't show you the discrimination, it doesn't show you the stigma, and the exclusion that you experience often on a day-to-day basis. And so in some ways, those can be quite sanitized, those exercises can be quite sanitized, and they don't really get us to the heart of the issue around how we're just really uncomfortable with people who are different. And so I'm always reluctant to move in the direction of simulations. And I just wanted to pick up on that point, Cathy.
No, I appreciate that. And I do think that it's limited, and then the person goes back to the life that they have. But that is a question. So I don't have to exactly feel what it's like for someone who has a disability, no more than I'm only 5 feet tall, and I don't always appreciate, or other people don't always appreciate, what it's like to be short versus tall. But how do we make sure that everyone is included, or that those that don't have those issues keep them at the forefront of their mind when they are developing these things? And I think what I said at the beginning is part of it. You just have the end user, you have people involved in the project right from the get-go, and that helps bring up the points that are important. But maybe there are other things too, and you may, because you've had that experience on a full-time basis, may have other thoughts for how that can be brought to the forefront and kept there.
Great. Actually, so that discussion that was related to one of the questions I wanted to ask, which is exactly the stigma. Cathy is probably aware, is definitely aware, that many of the people who have severe visual impairment, especially if it happened to them at young age, are reluctant to use their white cane. And a large part of it is because of the stigma. It's because of what they go through on a daily basis. At the same time, Cathy, you raised a very good point that people have to continue to use the system, the mobility, the T, or T is at the subway, the underground train in Boston, to raise the awareness, to show that they have to go through the struggle. So in Boston, Boston is actually relatively one of the better cities in the United States, if I may say, not compared to Europe, of course, but within the United States, it's more accessible, or at least tries to be more accessible. But it rarely happens that or actually it happens frequently that I'm on the subway and you hear the announcement that the elevator or lift in this station is not working. You have to go down 2 stops next, 1 or 2 stops next, get off the T, go to the other side of the street, get on the bus to come back to the other side of the street that you were. And this is accepted. This is very interesting, because I'm working in escape anxiety research. It said it's very raised about awareness about vision, and still when I talk to my colleagues, we have still this conversation that, okay, what is the solution? How can they fix that? The elevator is out of service. How can we have bold and ambitious, as Charlotte mentioned, goals for projects that are not just patches, that are genuinely a fundamental part of inclusive design? And within current context is we have the challenge of economy and economic viability, but how can we make that a priority, that exclusive design from base, as not just, as I said, a patch or just check a box? Charlotte, Cathy.
So I'm happy to go. I think one of the things is to have good frameworks in place. So again, the convention provides a lot of direction in that regard. And then, as I mentioned, within the bank, we have developed an environmental social framework, which is a safeguarding tool for all of our projects. And within that, we now have a specific indicator on universal access. And so that is triggered at the stage of design. So it requires you to go back and to think about, you know, you might be designing a metro system in country X that is fully accessible, but you haven't thought about, you know, how the person crosses the street, right? And those factors need to be built in. And that's why I was saying it then becomes really important that you have those multidisciplinary discussions. That, you know, the transport people are speaking to the urban planners are speaking to the end, everybody's speaking to the end user. But I think there's that sense of really sharing that, you know, the way people move, or the pathways that are needed, because there's no sense in having, you know, a fantastic accessible metro system and you come out of the elevator and you can't get across the street. And I've seen that in some major capitals.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about making things more accessible for everyone, it has to be a sort of global plan. And I don't mean global just the world, I mean global even when you're talking about one city or one area, in that you're absolutely right. If only one piece works well, and the other pieces don't, then there isn't going to be the advantage to someone who needs that accessibility. Like you said, if they have a great subway, but then they get off of it and can't cross the street, or can't get into a building where they want to work, where the elevators are down and now they're stuck, you know, how do we deal with that? And so I think that on a larger scale, as there is greater urban planning and even rural planning, that we need to make sure that the disability community, and even the fact that, you know, we're going to have a tremendous number of elders coming up in the world, at least here in the US, you know, the baby boomer generation, of which I am a part, also is already older, and a large group coming even behind them that are also part of that group. And we'll have more short-term and long-term issues. And so how do we make sure that all of that is in the works today, as communities are talking about what their communities are going to look like in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years? And then also, how can we leverage technology? So it's interesting because there's a part of what they do when they're looking at these driverless cars. There's a technology called LiDAR. And I saw a couple of years ago someone demonstrate a sort of handheld LiDAR system. And I went up to him and said, well, how can we use this for people who are visually impaired? Because what it does is it bounces off things to let you know that there are obstacles. And it never really went anywhere. And then just this week, I was reading an article that there is a company that was formed looking at how to use LiDAR for people who are visually impaired. So, so I think that these technologies are out there. They're being used in certain ways, but they certainly can be used in a broader sense. And maybe that's part of it too, that we encourage these companies to spend 10 or 20% of their resources on using it, not just for the 85%, but the, you know, 15% or 20%, or, you know, that's another thing. I'm not sure we even know how many people with disabilities, both short-term disabilities and long-term disabilities, even exist. And so either way, anything we do and take those resources means that it will be useful for everyone. In the end, it will be universal design and everyone will benefit.
And I would just say there's a need to take an integrated network approach to it, right? And look at the end-to-end solutions and incorporate both accessibility and universal design features. But I also think that it's really important for us to think about accessibility and mobility beyond just ramps, because too often that's where we end up, right? People just want to focus on having ramps, and it has to take into account both the physical, but also information technology and that interface. And And it needs to think about things like signage. I mean, those are really important pieces when addressing mobility.
Beautiful, thank you. Before I ask my next question, if audience have question, you can either type it there or raise hand and we can get to you. In the meantime, Andrew, if you have a question, please go, then I ask my later.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Charlotte and Cathy. Very interesting perspectives, both from the macro and the micro point of view. So really good. I have a specific question for Charlotte. So you mentioned having a framework and a set of norms, and that's all really good. But I imagine when you go to see politicians, how do you kind of get buy-in from them? How do you, because perhaps they see this kind of nice to have rather than something which is essential?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and as you can imagine, one that we're confronted with fairly often. And I think here are two things. I think it's really important to have a good storyline, right? So the data and the analysis. And then I think, as I was saying, if you're able to have an analysis, a cost-benefit analysis, that makes the deal sweeter. You're able to say, look, this is how you will benefit from ensuring that your bus rapid transit system is accessible. You know, this is what you'll benefit from that. So that's really an important piece. The other important piece is to have to show countries what's possible, because I think what we find often is that, you know, accessibility features in many countries, in developing countries, is not something that's readily in the minds of the policymaker. So bringing that to the fore is really important. And then facilitating policy dialogue period, with organizations of persons with disabilities in country is a really important piece to try and move that needle. And then I think, to a point that Cathy made, is, you know, yes, of course, it's good for persons with disabilities, but it's going to be good for a whole host of people. And so that is a really important way to wedge the issue in further.
Yes, I mean, it's just struck me whilst you've been speaking that disability isn't a kind of binary state. There's really a kind of spectrum or a continuum. And, you know, so probably people like myself, maybe who need to wear glasses now and whose hearing's not as good as it was, I'm actually benefiting from some features when I travel on the bus or the train. You know, the writing's larger, perhaps the signage is bigger, or there's kind of written announcements as well as the verbal ones. So so there's kind of like benefits that are more wider than just for what you would classify as the kind of people who are disabled. But okay, so maybe another question that I'd like to ask both of you, Cathy and Charlotte, is it seems like a lot of what your work is around is kind of retrofitting additional features to the existing systems. You know, so adding things to make them better for people with a disability. But if you were building something from the ground up, you know, so maybe I'm thinking of kind of like developing economies, places where, you know, new cities and settlements are evolving rapidly. How would you do things differently to how they're currently done?
So I think that was something I kind of touched upon before, which is that if you're developing new projects, and even if they're not going to come to fruition for a few years, that right at the beginning of that planning stage, the kinds of additions or modifications to maybe the way things are done currently that will benefit ultimately everyone, but certainly need to be thought of in terms of the benefit to people who are disabled, should be there right from the beginning. And it doesn't always have to be in the product itself. It can be in the use of the product. So for example, there are apps on the phone that may help you in using a device or using transportation that is not changing the transport vehicle, but is giving people better access to using that technology. So I think it can be done in a variety of ways. but it's, I think that as new technology comes along, we need to think about how to incorporate that. And it's not just retrofitting, because I think retrofitting becomes challenging and sometimes can feel a little bit like it's kind of been thrown together because it's hard to do it in a way that is smooth. But especially in developing countries or countries where they haven't had much of this, or areas where we're adding transportation, like here in Boston, they are certainly even adding subway lines and bus lines and things like that to areas that are now either more populated or becoming more developed. Then right from the get-go, we need to make sure that that those kinds of things are available. And the other is, if we're looking outside of the direct transportation, people also will find themselves needing to do more walking or more transporting of themselves, whether it's walking, whether it's in a wheelchair, whether it's on a bicycle, whatever it is, as perhaps they have visual issues and can't drive as easily. So we need to have things that are close by, we need to have things that are accessible, and we need to make sure that the roads are safe and have, wider, edges to them, or whatever it is, so that they can do it. Like here, they've taken actually away a certain amount of parking and developed bike lanes, because a lot of people in the city ride bicycles. So we could think about doing more of those kinds of things as well. I think, Charlotte's right in that if only one piece of it works and then you can't do the other pieces, that's a problem. And I think that having even laws, for example, like curb cuts, they weren't required at one time, but now anything new that gets done has to have that. And I think it's very doable. It's only a piece of it, but it's very doable. It's like when we say, okay, if you're building a new apartment building, you need to keep some units accessible, or you need to keep them affordable. I think we can just incorporate it in policy without making it burdensome.
Okay. Yeah, and I can pick up on that, on the point around burdensome, because I think there are two aspects to that. One is the cost factor. And so, one of the case that we make within the bank is that, research shows us that if you build in a manner that is accessible from the get-go, the cost for that is only 1 to 3% of the overall project cost. However, if you don't, and you come back and retrofit, the cost goes, skyrocketing. So that's an incentive for you to think about building back, for building, accessibly from the onset. And then I think, the other thing that I would put in place, and this is something that certainly I've been involved in, is to support the development of building codes in developing countries, so that you have a standard, or that you introduce standards that are good practice, and that enables people to have something to follow. And then I think, it's then important, once you begin to get that into all the project documents, it becomes part of your standard way of working, you build it into your procurement. Procurement is really important, particularly when you're looking at ICT. You need to make sure that you're building that into your procurement documents. And then you begin to normalize it. So, I mean, I live in Washington, D.C., and there are curb cuts basically everywhere. And everybody uses the curb cuts. People who are pulling, their little roller bag, and people who have kids in push carts. And it just becomes something that people expect to see. And so I think for me, it's also about normalizing it and making it just part of good design, which is essentially what universal design is about.
Okay. If you could just follow up on that with one specific thing. Are some kind of like settlement designs, I'm coming from a kind of transport planning point of view here, are some settlement designs and some modes inherently more inclusive than others? So if you design a settlement around walking, so everything is relatively close, does that make it more inclusive from a disability point of view?
I would say yes, of course, if the environment itself is accessible, right? So again, I use a chair and I think about the physical environment. So if I can get to the post office, the library, my voting station, my health clinic, and all those places are nearby and accessible, then yes, absolutely. But if I live in a city that doesn't provide that, then it changes considerably. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Great. We have a question or a point raised by one of the audience. I said Cathy brought up a point that I find interesting. What would it be like to live in a world where the basic challenge is that of height? A few years ago, after a training in compassion and care at Harvard, in a group discussion with one of the participants, brought up her challenge being a tall person and situated in numerous challenges of disability race that were being engaged. Whom should be at the table heard, given voice when discussing disability and accessibility? This is the first question.
So again, if it's designed well, it will work well for everyone. And what that may mean is having flexibility in the design. So for example, rather than me redesigning my kitchen so the counters are lower or the cabinets are lower or whatever it is, what if there was some opportunity to have like the sit to stand desks? You have a countertop that can be raised or lowered. Or there are some devices now that can be put inside any cabinetry. When you pull on it, the whole shelf comes down and now you can reach it and then you just tap it and it goes back up. So I think that creating opportunity and maybe starting with a framework of what are the kinds of things that are important. So do things, for example, what if there are children who need to use certain things? What if there are now teenagers? What if there are adults? What if there are older people? What if there's someone who's hearing impaired, visually impaired, has some kind of motor or mobility issue? What are the absolute basics of what they may need? And then how do we build in that flexibility? We have lighting now that we can make anywhere from, soft white to bright white. We can make it different colors. How does that benefit someone? And how can we do that? And the other is that has helped is that because of this technology being available, and when it becomes something everyone uses, then you don't have the white cane issue. Then you don't have the issue of, I don't want to use this because it makes me look different. Because the child in a classroom who gets an iPad, now becomes the hero of the classroom instead of the disabled child, because everybody wants that. But then when all of a sudden everyone in the class is using it, they're just one of the people in the class, even if theirs has to have things, blown up larger or on a particular kind of stand or a switch attached to it because they can't use their hands well. That still keeps them relatively in the realm of, I'm willing to use this because I'm kind of like everybody else. And so I think that if we, again, include that, like Charlotte said, right from the development, from procurement to design to, well, design and then the procurement of the pieces and how it's all put together, I think we're going to find that the costs of those things have come way down. They're much easier to incorporate than retrofit, much easier, and absolutely benefit everybody.
Thank you. Charlotte, the second question directed, if you want to say anything about this question, you can go ahead. If not, the second question is more probably directed at you, but do you have any thought on this one?
No, I mean, I agree with Cathy. So how about giving me the second one?
Okay, yes. So they said, unfortunately, developing countries are often unable to beat their own design, not because of lack of design ideas, but because Western space readily dictate how accessibility should be implemented. How do you, what are your thoughts on this, and how do you propose to overcome?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that I think the beauty of universal design is that it's universal. And it is something that can be used in different economies. You know, I have, you know, in my work, I have seen accessibility features built by using local materials. I mean, the point there is to ensure that you're building in safety and that you're building to requirement or standards. And that's why I was really pushing the importance of having in place standards. But the materials can vary from country to country based on what's available. So I don't think, you know, the idea is to say this is the only way you can address accessibility. There are different ways that you can, but the standards really are the same. I mean, a gradient for a ramp is a standard gradient. And so you build to that gradient. And I think that that's really useful. Again, you can do other things to address context, but I think the universality of universal design is what is so attractive. And I will go back to the other question around who comes to the table. You know, of course, as Andrew mentioned, I mean, disability is a continuum, right? There are a whole host of different types of disabilities. And it would be difficult if you brought everybody to the table, and that's highly unlikely. But I think if you stick to the principles that are embedded in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, you can get there, right? And so you don't have to be necessarily saying, how do I build for, you know, a person who is a double amputee or, you know, or a person who uses a wheelchair. But you start to think again about the 7 principles of universal design and how those can be implemented. And I think, you know, thinking about the person is really important here. So I always go back to the convention to seek guidance.
Beautiful, thank you. We want to finish on time. I would like to ask one final question from both speakers. If you want to propose a research question and a topic to teach, research question to study at a university, an academic institution, and a topic to teach any graduates that come out of university, what would those be?
Well, I think the first thing would be to make sure that there's a course in every university for pretty much every discipline, that they have some appreciation for the kinds of things that can be included in what they do, everything from making a PDF document accessible, because when we talk about these things, the information about these systems, for example, have to get out to people. And so how do we give everyone an opportunity to see how it can apply within what they're doing, and to have some opportunity for it not only to be taught, but even to bring in people, if they aren't already there in their course, who can help them better understand it from a human side, a live human side.
And I would say to ensure that all architects, transport engineers, civil engineers, roadworks engineers, urban planners, that they have disability, they have issues around disability, accessibility, and inclusion and mobility streamed throughout their work and throughout their study. I'm reluctant to have a standalone class because that's often the class that nobody takes. So trying to work it into everything you do, I think, is really important. And therein is the idea of mainstreaming disability inclusion.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. It was amazing. Let Andrew wrap up the session.
Yeah, thank you very much, Charlotte and Cathy. As with all these mobility roundtables, we've had another stimulating discussion, and I've certainly learned a lot of things that I didn't know 1 hour ago. And it's just great to hear perspectives, as I said, both from a kind of macro kind of policy and strategy level and down from the micro, the implementation and the detail. And clearly both have a role to play to create the truly inclusive system. So thank you both very much for your contributions today. It just remains for me to say, just before we go, that the next Mobility Roundtable we think will be on the 21st of January, and in the roundtable on that day we'll be looking at mobility and transit if you're in the US, or mobility and public transport, how we describe it in the UK, with the question being, is this the end of urban public transport or urban transit? You probably know that public transport or transit is in a crisis at the moment due to COVID. Does it mark the start of a new beginning, or is it a kind of the end? So that's what we'll be discussing next time. All it remains for me to say is thank you very much, everybody, for coming again today, and thanks again to Charlotte and Cathy for a really good discussion.